here, and History 202 here at EOU. It's week 8. This week, at the end of this week, you have paper number 2, paper option number 2, that is due. So if you didn't do the first one, then I would highly recommend you do the second one. You only have to do one paper during the term, and you get to choose, of 3 of them, but it's probably a good idea to not make that paper choice the very end of the term, just because, one never knows what kinds of, other assignments from other classes and so forth. I would advise, probably, if you didn't do the first one, do the second. And of course, if you want to improve your grade from the first paper, you can do the second paper and try to score better. Look at the comments I made in your first paper, and then use those to revise the paper and make it better. I have added a video on paper writing guidelines into the modules for this week that I think will help us with the papers. This is from the last time I taught the first part of this class, which was about a year ago, I think. So it's from a 201 class, but there's some slight differences. I changed the project very slightly, but you only have to do one paper instead of 2 is the basic change. But the paper itself is the same. So if you watch that little film, that little video that I have of my own that I put in there, it will really take you step by step through what I'm really looking for on these papers and how to make an A on these papers. So watch that presentation. This week we're dealing with the Cold War, and I have two other things I'd like to see you, watching. One is, of course, my lecture. I have a recorded lecture this week, as always, on the origin of the Cold War, defining the Cold War, what is the Cold War, what brought it about. And then I have a 15-minute link to a documentary film called Atomic Cafe, that is about the atomic bombing of the development of the atomic bomb, the usage of the bomb in Japan during World War II, and its subsequent influence or effect on the United States, American culture, American society during the 1940s and 50s. So I'd like to see you watch that 15-minute film snip. It's only 15 minutes, the bit that I have in there, and then use that in your participation in the discussion forum for this week. Let's see. I think that's it for this week. So reading chapter 23. We also have a couple of primary source documents on the Cold War for this week as well. But from Give Me Liberty, our phoner textbook, read chapter 23 on the origins of the Cold War. Great discussion as always. The factoid for this week. So for extra credit, just go to the extra credit discussion board. Just tell me this factoid. Just write it down in the extra credit discussion board before Wednesday by midnight. You get what amounts to 1 point towards, each time you do this, 1 point towards a final test score. If you did all of them, then of course you get 10 points on one of your final test scores. So it can really help your grade. It could theoretically be the difference between a C or a B or a B or an A. It could be the difference at the end of the term in a letter grade. So go and post the extra credit factoid in the little extra credit discussion board at the bottom of your modules for this week. This factoid is this. The father of containment. So containment policy refers to the U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The United States sought to use economic and military assets, I suppose you'd say, to contain any expansion of the communist bloc. It becomes known as the containment policy, and it takes a number of different forms. The Vietnam War was a product of the global containment policy. So was the Korean War, the Berlin blockade and airlift in 1948 in the context of the containment policy. So the father of the containment policy, this is the factoid, the father of that fundamental policy during the Cold War is George Kennan, Kennan, who was an American statesman who was a Russian specialist. And specifically the factoid is this. George Kennan wrote something called the Long Telegram, highly highly classified report about the nature of the Soviet system at the end of World War II, and it was so kind of sensitive that George Kennan referred to himself as Mr. X, and his telegram became known as the Long Telegram. So Mr. X and the Long Telegram, George Kennan's influential letter to the President of the United States, ultimately Harry Truman, that creates the backbone ultimately for the formation of the containment policy under the Truman administration, the policy to contain the forces of Soviet communism in the world. That policy would change quite a lot, by the way, and much to the chagrin of George Kennan. So George Kennan was not an advocate of the kind of containment policy that took the United States into the Vietnam War in the 1960s, but nonetheless was the father of that policy. So Mr. X, the Long Telegram, 1946. Okay, guys, let's have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions.